instead of consumer social as the bucket of like apps that help people talk and share, just social design as a practice of helping people interact with each other. And what's cool about this definition, again, is it has nothing to do with computers or phones. And in fact, social designers have been helping people interact with each other in the physical world for forever. I'm Sachin, and I am the co-founder and CEO of a company called Cocoon. It's a new kind of social app. It's organized around small, tight-knit groups, and the goal is just to help that group feel closer to one another every day. That's kind of our raison d'etre, what we're trying to do. Prior to this, I was a product manager at Facebook. I worked there for a number of years. I crossed paths with Shabir. He beat me on the basketball court a lot, but we're still friends. And at Facebook, I started off on the growth team in 2011 in Canada. That's where I'm from. I moved down to California. And then I worked on the ads team for a little bit. And then I worked on, I guess, the components of Facebook that would be called kind of like consumer social. I like to claim that I was one of the inventors of Facebook stories. And I worked on the camera and the little what's on your mind box, and basically all the tools that are trying to help people share more with their friends and family. And so consumer social, I think, can be kind of the theme of this. I put it in air quotes because I kind of hate the term consumer social. And I don't know why, but as I was prepping for this, I kind of thought of a few things. And I think the main thing is that it sort of feels very transactional, and it covers like an umbrella that is so wide in terms of what these products and services are actually trying to do. And the only thing in common is that they're like apps on a phone for the most part. But if you think about something like TikTok or like, I mean, maybe Cocoon is kind of on the other end of the spectrum. Like they have some things in common, but I think in terms of like the problem we're trying to solve, it's just so different that I find consumer social as like an umbrella to be a little bit less constructive. But I will talk a little bit about that, and I know that's kind of like a relevant thing. But I kind of wanted to start a little bit with a little bit of a divergence, and then we'll kind of come back to that.
Kind of, yeah.
But yeah, I wanted to start with this sort of other concept of instead of consumer social as the bucket of like apps that help people talk and share. Just social design as a practice of helping people interact with each other. And what's cool about this definition, again, is it has nothing to do with computers or phones. And in fact, social designers have been helping people interact with each other in the physical world for forever. And these are all examples of tools and spaces that have been designed and like honed and A/B tested and iterated upon for thousands of years for the purpose of helping people come together in some shape or form to some end. And I find, like, I guess the first point to make is that there's a lot we can learn about how people have designed things like this in the physical world that are really, really directly instructive if you're trying to design a social app right now to help people come together in some way. So I had been thinking about all this stuff a fair bit, and specifically I'd been thinking a lot about cities. Before starting Cocoon, while I was at Facebook, I think a lot about cities because in some ways Facebook is sort of this like mega metropolis of the internet where 2 billion people came together and kind of got like jammed into one space. And in 2018, which was the last year I was at Facebook, I think we were already a couple of years into this like reckoning or grappling or however you want to describe it of like all these sort of unintended consequences of that mass congregation. And we were just running into all these things that we kind of like didn't really design for or didn't really predict. And they were all outcomes. They were all kind of like problems related to density, problems related to quick congregation, things like the spread of misinformation and like spam bots and like whatever problems exist with Facebook, I think for the most part can be kind of mapped back to this mass congregation. But this wasn't the first time that this had happened. This had happened before. With cities. And so that's why I was thinking a lot about cities. And in sort of during the Industrial Revolution, this mass congregation happened before where cities became this place of economic opportunity and like lots of people flocked to cities really quickly. And what's sort of interesting is you look back to like this time era, the beginning of this curve, it was kind of like an unmitigated disaster. Like disease and crime and smog and sanitation. Like there were all these problems that humans had to grapple with for the first time that were all, again, just problems related to density. And like, if you read some of the writing from that era, it's really just like kind of insane to see some of it. And it sort of feels like crazy that this happened. I was just reading a thing the other day that talked about how like when they were designing the first sanitation systems, like one of the big problems was that people would just throw their trash out the window and like literally just throw their trash on the streets. And that's totally fine when your closest neighbor is like 10 miles away. But when you're living in a tenement house, that's going to like cause cholera outbreaks, and it's like, that's not going to fly. And so it just struck me that there were all these things that like now we take for granted and now we think are obvious. But like back then, if your house got set on fire, like there was a non-zero chance that the whole block is going to burn down or a whole city is going to burn down, because fire departments don't just like magically appear overnight. We have to like figure this out. So I was really inspired by this era of urbanization and looking at what happened and all these problems that occurred, because it sort of seemed like we were just running into all these same sorts of problems with the internet, with Facebook in particular. And this was 2018 again, and I'd been at Facebook for a bunch of years, and I had just met and started working with this amazing designer. Actually, before I go into that in a sec, one last quick example of cities that maybe can hammer home how much I think we can learn. There's this guy, William White, who was this, I guess he was like a sociologist, and in the 1970s, the city of New York commissioned him to figure out what made certain public spaces work better than other public spaces in New York. Like what made some public spaces full of life and energy and people were using it all the time, and others were just dead. And he ran this experiment that I think is one of like the most interesting data sets for social designers, where the way he did this was he basically just set up cameras on the top of rooftops and like spied on strangers for like many days in a row. I'm pretty sure you wouldn't be able to do this anymore, which is why this makes it even especially interesting and unique. And he looked at just the way people came together, and he came up with all of these really interesting patterns and insights. And this is a page from this book called The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, which is awesome and highly recommend. And this is the location of street conversations lasting 2 minutes or more outside this building. And you can see that by far the most of them cluster around the corner. And then there's another little cluster outside of the entry of the building. And like, if you design social apps, you can probably see some parallels here already around just like how do you shape an environment to be conducive to interaction? And this has happened with cities, and very much is happening with digital spaces now too. So I had been like really obsessed with cities in sort of the last era of my time at Facebook. And I met this designer, Alex, who's now my co-founder at Cocoon, and we had been working together at Facebook, but we were kind of contemplating leaving. And this was a note that I sent to him in July of 2018. And there were a couple of points here that I think kind of like are really the true origin story of Cocoon, in case that's interesting to you all, and kind of lead into some of the predictions and observations I have about the future of consumer social that hopefully are somewhat useful. And I thought I'd just share this for a sec. The first point here was that like we were at a point where everyone thought that Facebook was like destroying the world, and phones were destroying the world, and like screen time, and just like this was sort of like the peak of that, maybe not the peak, but like the beginning of that mania. And my take on this was like I wouldn't have expected us to have figured out all this stuff if you look at the lessons of urbanization, especially that when that big migration and congregation happened, we had these problems related to density, and we were running into them now. At the same time, working at Facebook, I felt like, and at the time, I enjoyed my time there for the most part, and I think it was like a really formative experience. But working on the types of things, at least, that we were working on at Facebook, felt like signing up to sort of figure out the public works and the infrastructure and like the fire departments, and it just wasn't really the kind of work that we were that excited about. And I think this like city lens metaphor helped us really kind of make that observation and determination that we would be, I think, a little bit more fired up about striking out on our own and thinking about how to attack this problem from a different lens. And the question that we left with was basically this question at the bottom, which is like, what happens when we start to primarily occupy digital spaces instead of physical spaces and go through that same arc that happened in the real world? And what was happening, especially over the last few years, is we kind of have this like relatively new phenomenon with our phones now, which is there's all this like found time in our day where we have like 1 or 2 moments in between things. And we have this new superpower where we can basically access anyone or anything in the world instantly and for free. But the way we were using that superpower, and I think the way we're still using it now, is a little bit like sad how few options we have in terms of like what, like if you just look at the spaces you have access to that you can occupy in that moment, it's like pick your endless jar of content to consume and just like scroll through for some like light entertainment for a couple minutes, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or Twitter or whatever it is. They're all basically just endless jars of other people's content. And it just felt like that was actually the true underlying reason for the like malaise that everyone was feeling around screen time and phones and Facebook and everything. And we just felt like if we flipped that around and just looked at like, how can we take this new superpower and put it to its best use, that would be a really exciting thing to go work on. So this was actually the question that led to Cocoon. We didn't start working on Cocoon for like 6 months after this. In fact, when we left Facebook, we kind of really tried pretty hard to not work on this problem of like consumer social stuff again, after having like banged our head on it for 7 years, for me in particular. This was the problem that we kind of set out to solve at a high level, and it kind of led us to Cocoon. But that I think maybe is a segue into things that I'll share about the future of consumer social. And maybe these are more kind of like questions to pose and observations rather than like hot takes or predictions. But I felt like I was kind of invited here for the hot takes, so I must leave you with a few. But yeah, they'll be kind of mostly through that lens, which hopefully isn't too much of a stretch. So this is really the question I ask myself when thinking about the future of consumer social, which is what happens when digital spaces follow the same arc that physical spaces have. And I think there's a lot to learn about what happened in the real world. One, and maybe this is probably not a crazy take at all, is that I think digital spaces will start to specialize to a really extreme degree, and that the future looks a lot more like Tokyo, or like a city like Tokyo, than like the classic like 1950s American suburb where everyone lives in the same house and drives the same car and eats at the same restaurant, which is largely the world we're living in today, I think, on our phones, where when you think about that, like that 2-minute gap in your day, where am I going to go? Like, what are the chances that the best place for me to go and spend my 2 minutes right now is the same best place as everyone else's and like 2 billion other people's? And I think the chances really, if we had access to the spaces we crave and deserve, would be like pretty low. But that's really where we're at right now, with a handful of apps that are kind of all the same thing, like are all basically the same recipe. And that's where we're at today. But if you've ever like spent time in a place like Tokyo, which I think has done a really good job of figuring out how to congregate many people in a small place, it's not like, I don't know like how much time, I haven't spent much time in Tokyo. I've only been a couple of times, but the first thing that surprised me when I went there is that it's not like what you see in the picture when you like look at like the stock photo of Tokyo of like the big skyscrapers and bright lights everywhere. There's all these little pockets and neighborhoods that are specialized, and you can just have such specialized experiences, and you can like go to this place that's been making like the best bowl of ramen, that they just do one thing and you just go and eat this one thing, and there's no menu, and it's like served by the same person, and it's like such a specific experience. But if you want the best bowl of ramen like that, you're going to get it. And I think that this is going to start to happen to a much greater extent in the digital world. And the reason it hasn't happened yet largely has to do mostly with like network effects and business models and things that aren't going to last forever. Like the fact that there's really been a one-size-fits-all business model on the mobile internet, which has been like you have to get to hundreds of millions of free users and then serve them ads if you want to make money. And I think with the rise of subscriptions, which we'll talk about in a second, and a bunch of other trends that are happening, I think this will unlock the ability for our phones to start to look a bit more like Tokyo and highly specialized. And when you have that 2-minute gap in your day, there'll just be a much vaster menu of options. So that's the first point to make, I think. I'll keep going. This will probably just be like 3 or 5 more minutes. And so we can kind of stop for questions at any point too. But we can also just kind of finish this and then free for all. Does that sound right to you, Cameron? Okay, I think I've lost you on mute, so I'll just keep going. Okay, the second thing is that if you think about the physical spaces and the digital spaces we occupy as starting to sort of like converge and merge in our brains, I think that one really interesting and positive side effect is that when people think about where they spend their time and money, they won't categorize things by like, is this on my phone or is this in the real world? They'll really look at this through the lens of like, what is the job to be done here with my dollar and what am I actually trying to do? And in the case of Cocoon, as an example, Cocoon is a paid app, and the way it works is one person can sponsor the group on everyone's behalf and pay $40 for the year. And when we were fundraising, everyone was like, who's going to pay for a social app when like people pay for like Netflix and Spotify and don't really have room for like multiple consumer subscriptions, and people aren't going to subscribe to lots of things. And so how are you going to compete with like Netflix? And I think like my answer, and I think this is trying to bear out a little bit, is like, we're not really trying to compete with Netflix. We're like in the category of like taking your family out for dinner and doing a nice thing for your group that brings you closer together and is like a nice thing. And I think if everyone was thinking about consumer subscriptions as an example, or like the money I spend on my iPhone as a finite zero-sum game, that would be really hard for something like Cocoon. But if people start to think about the physical world and the digital world as sort of fungible, then I think we'll reorient around like the jobs to be done and like, what am I hoping to get with this investment? And I think that's really good news for consumer subscriptions and good news for apps in general. So when I see people talk about the rise of consumer subscriptions, and if you all are thinking about this in any way as like part of how you think about business models for a startup or what to do next, I would say this is one of those ones where there's an asterisk, which is like, this hasn't really been proven yet. But I think we're starting to see the undercurrents of people starting to think more about like, I'm going to pay for calm and I'm not going to compare that to Netflix. And if I did do that and looked at like the time I spent watching Netflix and the vast majority, or like the vast library of content that I get for my $10 a month on Netflix versus my $8 a month on calm, like that's like a hard comparison to grapple with. But if I compare the time I spend on calm and that investment to like a therapist or like a gym membership or something like that, all of a sudden it seems like that might just be like a no-brainer. And I think that, I mean, Calm now has like 2-3 million subscribers, and so I think they are really at the forefront of proving this model. Like it's not just like Netflix and Spotify and everyone else can go home. And I think this is going to be like really good news and just open up such a wide kind of going back to like the specialization bit. I think this is what's going to enable that specialization, is that people will start to think about subscriptions very differently. A third one that I've been thinking about a lot lately is that as we start to occupy digital spaces a lot more with our time and sort of just think about that as like a fungible thing in the physical world, we will like basically collectively realize that most of our relationships are digital by default, in that the primary way we are going to nurture this relationship and spend time with this person is going to be mediated through technology and not in person. And this, I mean, 2020, I think, has been an accelerant to this, but not really in the sense of like obviously this year, like every relationship just was forced to be digital by default unless you lived with that person. But like when I think about my like family, for example, my parents are still in Canada, my sister's in New York, my family's kind of all over the place. Like that was already a digital by default relationship. This year, it just meant that like it had to be the case the entire year and we couldn't visit each other at all. But like, it's not like when the coronavirus is done, we're going to like go back to seeing each other all the time. This was already the case. The thing that's happening now is we are just spending so much more time on our phones and in digital spaces and connected to people that there's just so much more room for interaction to happen digitally that like it'll just tip the balance. And so if you look at this chart on the left, this has changed over time, I think, like over the grand scheme of history, but like this didn't change with like COVID or with like phones. And this chart, I just saw it a couple of days ago on this really awesome site, Our World in Data. And it's like pretty morbid to look at if you just look at like the curve, especially of time spent alone and time spent with partner. And obviously this is time spent in the real world, right? This isn't taking into consideration time you're spending like what we're spending right now. But if you look at that, basically at any slice of age cohort, I think the reality is that most of your relationships will be digital by default. And I think my take here, I guess, is that that's just going to require a degree of like infrastructure and tools and spaces to support that reality and to like support these relationships to the extent that they deserve, that we are, again, nowhere near having figured out. So when people tell me that like consumer social is done and figured out and over and like Facebook and WhatsApp won, I kind of pose a question of like, if WhatsApp is going to be the primary vessel to your closest relationships and your loved ones for the rest of your life, that would just be like a really sad reality, that like an SMS app that was designed for free and fast utilitarian texting is going to be like the primary way I stay close with my mom. That's like, that would be crazy to me. And there's reasons why we got here and why that's the case. But I think if you put all of this into the blender, I think there's going to be this pull of demand that like, I just will demand a better digital home base than WhatsApp for my family. And it will be enabled by things like consumer subscriptions and consumer behavior and a few of these other things that we're talking about, that like, I view the next 5-10 years of especially like close relationships and the infrastructure we're going to need to support them as really like open greenfield Wild West. Like this is not, we haven't figured this out yet. Which is really exciting to me, and I hope exciting to any of you that are thinking about consumer social and the opportunities here. This is maybe a little bit more of a speculative one, but in a lot of ways, I think where we're at right now is dealing with these problems related to density. So this is a moment that is a reaction to this mass congregation on Facebook in particular, and WhatsApp and Instagram and Twitter. And we all basically went from living in the country to like being jammed together in tenement houses. And we're like, shit, like we have to figure out how to handle this. And there's like a bit of a like pullback that's happening right now, a retreat to messaging apps, a retreat to private spaces, which I think Cocoon is hopefully able to shape in a positive direction and play a role in. This is like a farther out prediction, but I think like at some point, 5, 10, 15 years from now, like a bit further out, I think the problems related to density, we're gonna like swing down to the other side of the pendulum, and there will be all these new problems related to like, I think what I'd say like balkanization or the fact that we kind of just like went from being in public to being like extremely in private because the public sphere just broke on the internet. And that's going to be like an interesting world. And this is something I think about a lot with Cocoon as obviously kind of going down, like if we started on the top end of this curve and now we're kind of swinging down to the bottom, we're like part of that. But I think there's like, in the same way that as we were, if you could scroll back 10, 15 years ago to like when we were building Facebook, if we could have had the benefit of hindsight and thought about, okay, how do we preemptively avoid these problems related to density? This is something that I think about a lot, and I would encourage you all to think about if you're kind of in this trend of the retreat from public to private. Like, how can we design our private spaces now that we're building to begin with in a way that can preemptively solve some of these problems related to balkanization that I think will hit. And I think this is like a common thing in like technology and business, is that like problems create solutions, which create problems, which create solutions. And like the arc of, I think, like the social internet is, in my mind, going to be one that looks kind of like this curve, which is sort of like what you get when you hit a tuning fork, and like you get this dampening, and eventually you converge to some like happy middle ground. Like we have figured out how to live in cities now for the most part. Some cities are more well-rounded than others, but like overall, the experience of living in a city right now is just like quite good compared to what it was 200 years ago. And I think we're going to have that on the internet and in mobile and digital spaces that we occupy. It'll just take some time. And we're like probably just now on the like little like downward slope of that first big curve. And I think going back to the city comparison, I found this headline, which I thought was interesting. It was written in 2018, so like pre-COVID, that apparently millennials are moving to the exurbs in droves, which I, as a millennial, just did. And I think, again, this is a problem of like housing costs, and like there are problems related to density to this day that we're grappling with in cities. And in the real world, we're still kind of on this dampening curve as well. But this is maybe like less actionable, maybe just something to like noodle on if you're working on this space, that how can we preemptively handle these problems related to balkanization that we're going to hit, I think, if we go too far down this path. And then the last one I'll leave you with is hopefully an optimistic one if you're working on this space, which is that you are not late. We have not figured all of this out, and we're still very much in the phase of throwing trash out our windows and setting whole city blocks on fire. And again, if anyone tells, if I hear that like consumer social is dead and that like there's no opportunity, I just think like, man, like if this is the be all and end all, then that would be really sad. There's like a lot to figure out. So I'm really excited to be working on this space, probably a lot more so even than when I left Facebook and we started working on Cocoon. I think at the time I kind of like begrudgingly was like, I think we want to do this. This is like a problem we really care about, we know about. But now when I think about Cocoon and the opportunity just in this space, like, and I think this has been really illuminated with COVID and coronavirus and this year in 2020. When we were fundraising a year and a half ago, it really did feel like the nuclear winter of consumer social. And like we would get laughed out of meeting rooms. Like literally we did YC, and after demo day, you kind of like just congregate around this big lobby and you meet investors and like, we're like, hey, we're building this thing. And like literally like nine people out of 10, their eyes would just glaze over and they'd be like, we're only investing in enterprise, like get out of here kind of thing. But we were lucky to find that like small percentage of people where when they found we were serious and like had a thesis here and we really cared a lot about this, we were able to find really good partners. But I think this year has proven for sure that we are at this stage. And yeah, I hope I don't have to do another like Zoom family meeting anytime soon. And like, I'm sure everyone has had experiences like this with close friends and family, especially on the internet this year, where it's like, man, this is crazy. So I'll leave you with that. After this is, I mean, we've got lots of time left, so talk about whatever we want to talk about now. But if you ever want to talk about social design and any of these things, you can find me on the internet. And yeah, love to chat about any of this stuff. Cool. I'm going to stop my screen share now so I can look at you all again. All right, Cameron, how do you want to do this? Oh, exurbs. I just looking at the chat right now. It's sort of like, you could think of it as suburbs. I think the exact definition is it's like the next ring outside of suburbs.
I'm not sure if Cameron had a drop.
Yeah, I think we may have lost Cameron. So the insane are running the asylum. It's me. Do you want to just like call questions out or thoughts or anything? Or do you want to use the chat? I don't have access to the Slack. So if you all are in the Slack.
I only see like 5 or 6 questions popped in. So I guess if anyone wants to like ask a question, they can kind of jump in.
Yeah, should we just follow the Slack order? Like whoever asked the first question in Slack, do you want to?
Yeah, sure, I can do it. Satori, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much, Sachin. I've been a huge fan of Cocoon.
Thank you.
Working on building a group journal app to bring long-distance families closer together.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I saw your email. Yeah, it's nice to meet you.
Yeah, very nice to meet you. My question is, what was your biggest challenge so far and right now and in the future?
Just like in general with Cocoon?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, obviously, but I'm trying to think of one that might be like instructive to what you're building. And I mean, I think one big thing, because I know the space you're in is like, you're working on a very specific problem too. And I kind of like thinking back to the specialization thing, like one way to think about specialization is you have these like vertical social networks, which is like, we're going to take Facebook and make it for like people who like fly fishing or for like a very specific niche. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity there, but I think you're taking a very different approach, which is not like, let's take this tried and true tested recipe and then just like say, we're only going to attract people who look like XYZ. Which is almost more of like a go-to-market challenge than a product challenge. You're actually tackling a very difficult product challenge, which is, it's not like take this tried and true recipe and then apply it to one niche. It's like actually kind of from first principles, what is the right recipe to solve a very specific problem, which in your case, I think would be long distance families, togetherness, like sharing more of your daily life. And I think a big challenge is that you can't really follow that that playbook of like, how did Facebook grow or how did Instagram grow or whatever. And like one example for us, and I think for you, would be like, if you think about the way you typically grow a social app, that would work for any vertical social network that we talked about. That like, you know, you get someone to like download the app, you get them to like connect with 10 people that are already there, and then you get them to like invite 10 people or whatever and like sync their contacts, and like that's how you get the flywheel going. With something like Cocoon, like if you sign up for Cocoon and you're not already you haven't been invited to a Cocoon, we want to give you like a totally blank canvas and not be like, hey, here's like a bunch of people on Cocoon you can connect with. That would be bad. That would like ruin the whole point. And so like we had this funny moment when we launched where we kind of like accidentally went viral in Saudi Arabia because this influencer there like tweeted out his Cocoon, his like code, and was like, hey, add me on Cocoon. And he had like all these followers, and he was like, this is like a path type thing. Add me. It's like a close friends, close family thing. Add me on Cocoon. And all these like strangers joined his Cocoon. And then like all these people started to create new Cocoons and tweet out their invite codes, and then like write into us, be like, this app doesn't work. Like, how do you add friends? Like, you could only be in one Cocoon. And it was sort of like illustrative of this idea that like if we ever went viral to that extent, that would be really bad. Like, we have to think about growth differently. And we have this chicken egg problem, which is like, we can't connect you to people if you aren't in a Cocoon already. You have to basically create a Cocoon and invite people. And that's like a much harder onboarding problem than like sign up for Instagram and hey, here's like 10 people you can follow. So I think that's like maybe useful for you guys, that like, I guess the challenge and the challenge is that basically the ways that other social apps grow, and this is again why I think consumer social is sort of not that useful, is like, you can't follow those playbooks at all if you're basically solving a very specific problem, and you have to think about everything differently. So that's been the biggest challenge for Cocoon, is like, I think to some extent when we left Facebook, we're like, oh yeah, we know how to like build social things. And it's like the common denominator is not like social. It's like, yeah, we're trying to solve like a very different problem that requires a very different way of thinking.
Yeah, right. Oh, we don't have much playbook we can follow on. Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much.
Cool. Keep me posted. Okay, so I see some questions coming through in the
Peter Cho, you dropped your the next question in.
Awesome.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, the point you made, that you see and maybe hope that there's a trend that people are thinking about consumer subscriptions in a different way and anchoring it to different things besides just Netflix. I would love that to be true. I'm wondering if there are other examples that you can think of that sort of point towards that.
Yeah, totally. Okay, well, I mean, one big one I think is I kind of think of it like category by category. There's like dominoes that start to fall. And so like the first domino that fell was content, like entertainment content. That's like the Netflixes and Spotify's of the world did eat from like cable and like buying CDs. And like that domino fell like, I don't know, 10 years ago or something, maybe even longer. Another domino that is falling, I think, is wellness. And wellness covers a bunch of ground, health and fitness and meditation. I think like the fitness thing has been interesting. Like that's relatively new, that like Peloton didn't really exist like not that long ago. And you think about Peloton, like you're not comparing that probably to Netflix, even though it's still like streaming video content. You're comparing that to like going to the gym and buying exercise equipment. And I mean, Peloton's like super fucking expensive. So the fact that they've been able to like, I think they're, you know, you buy the bike, but you're also buying this, I don't subscribe, but I think it's like in the range of like $30, $40, $50 a month. I don't know if anyone knows.
40 bucks.
So much more expensive than like a Netflix. And I think that's been super interesting to see. There's a company called Noom that is doing really, really well. It's a weight loss app essentially, and it helps with like dieting. It's kind of like a nutrition app, really, or I guess, yeah, nutrition, weight loss kind of thing. And again, I think people aren't really comparing that to like their Netflix budget. They're comparing that to budget that would be spent in the real world for sure. So I guess that's sort of how I've been thinking about it. Like it's almost like vertical by vertical dominoes start to fall. And I think there's a bit of a flywheel where like on the third domino, you've already seen, you're like, oh, I already subscribed to like Peloton too. And like, so you're already like, by the fourth or fifth or sixth domino, I think everything just kind of converges. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thanks for sharing that.
Next question was actually mine. So how do you cultivate intimacy among a group of people? Obviously, I think, the problem with social these days, or even Zoom, right? You talked about the family meeting, is like you're kind of like just throwing everyone around a conference table and expecting them to just act.
Yeah.
And social media, we kind of end up like reverting to the lowest common denominator, talking about work or a blog post we just read, etc. So how do you think about like actually getting people to open up and really connect in these spaces?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think in some ways it's like the question. Our thesis for Cocoon is that, and this again kind of starts with the real world and studying what makes people feel close to one another, and what like forgetting about phones and digital stuff, and just like what goes into a close relationship. And there's quite a bit of like research and theory that suggests that the thing that strengthens a relationship is high frequency of lightweight interactions over a long period of time. And so like little bits of contact for a long period of time. And that's the thing that makes people feel closer, rather than like the once a year, like let's spend a day together kind of thing. And so the whole point of Cocoon in some ways is, so I guess then the way to solve closeness and intimacy is, how do you enable lightweight contact every day or over a long period of time? And then you kind of have to work backwards from like, okay, like if that's what we're trying to do, first off, like why doesn't it really work in messaging apps right now? And one big reason is that it feels really intense to like send a thing in a message thread that is not urgent and warrants like blowing up everyone's phone, especially if you're in like a large group chat. And so this is like a very specific kind of tactical product thing, but like what we were trying to do with Cocoon is build a vessel that is lightweight enough to allow for people to share mundane things in their life. And as a result of that, if we can get people to do that and kind of, and it's not trying to like create some new behavior or force you to do a thing you're not trying to do. This is basically like only for groups where they would actually want to feel closer to each other and want to share in that capacity. How do we remove all of the barriers to that frequent lightweight interaction that exist in social networks and in messaging apps? And in social networks, the big barrier is not that you don't have the tools to share a photo. Of course you do. It's that your audience became everyone you've ever met, and like the set of things that are relevant to everyone you've ever met is like, it's like nothing. It's like when you get married or start a new job or like have a baby. And so that's what like Facebook and Instagram kind of trend towards. And so that's the big barrier, is audience. With SMS and messaging apps, the barrier was not necessarily audience. They solved audience. It was that like the tools and the context were they were built around SMS, which is like urgent communication, back and forth, infinite thread. You wouldn't send anything that doesn't need a response. So we were thinking like, man, if we could just let you send a thing that doesn't need a response and that's not an awkward feeling, then like maybe that can help solve intimacy. And so, I mean, I don't know if that's not like the killer feature necessarily, but I think to answer that question, I think first we have to start with like, well, what actually makes people feel close to begin with? And then how do you work backwards from that and design a recipe that can enable that? And so for us, it was like frequent lightweight interaction, and how do we architect the whole system to enable that lightweight, low pressure vessel for sharing like a funny photo of my dog or something. And so everything in Cocoon is kind of designed around that attempt.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. Next question, I think Lauren, you asked one.
Yeah, hey, nice to meet you and really excited to be here. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Classic. So mine, it's not like I'm not sure I like have articulated the question quite right, but I'm thinking a lot about how to build this community that we're witnessing happening, especially in in-person events. If people come to discover like the brands and the styles and tips that we've created through our site, and that's kind of like the kicking off point and the sparked moment for them. But when I really think about how to build this community and unleash what's possible around shared interests, I'm not really interested in building my own tools. Do you think as we move forward, there's going to be an easy way for us to kind of remix all these community tools, or allow people to like kind of curate their profile using maybe like they recommended a style or recommended a tip that already exists on Instagram? Is there a way, do you think, that we could plug in these multiple community tools to allow them to kind of remix and curate that through our platform, if that makes sense? Or is that kind of like not the point at all of creating your own private social network?
Okay, let me make sure I understand the question correctly. So it's like you got this thing, it's primarily about like physical world, in-person community gathering. Can you still like find ways to leverage the existing like software-based tools to kind of help augment that without having to like build your own, you think?
Yeah, and like continue the conversation. So like they meet through us.
Yeah.
We have like an e-commerce online shop, but we know that there's a community that loves discovering the products that we sell. And we know that when we bring people together, they love talking to each other, and it sparks this interesting conversation that we want to harness and kind of help propel forward.
Got it.
So yeah.
Yeah, this is, I think there's a really interesting question within this question, which is, well, I think like I would optimistically be like, yeah, I think so. Like, I think there will be things I can point to some things that have come to mind. Like, I think there's been a bunch of these like white label community products that have basically just launched in the last like year or so, like Circle and even like Discord and stuff. Yeah. I think that's been really cool to see. I think one thing that's made me think of though is that this is a really good example of how trying to solve a problem related to density took us down this crazy pendulum swing of like closing off the social internet of like 10 years ago. So I used to work on the platform team at Facebook, and one of the things I worked on was like the open graph login with Facebook, like basically that whole like Facebook platform of other apps like feeding into and leveraging the social graph on Facebook. And that, well, I guess like we all kind of know how that went, but like I think like a lot of the lawsuits over the last couple of years and like the Cambridge Analytica stuff and like all that stuff was basically as a result of Facebook being maybe like too open. And at the time, Facebook was being heavily criticized for being a walled garden and too closed. And so then there was kind of a like, let's open up the social graph and let's let like other like, and the parallel here is like in some alternate reality, it's like 2020 and it should be really easy for you to like basically like let people press a button and they could immediately see which of their friends are part of your network. And like, you don't have to like rebuild it every time, because that's kind of where we're at right now with these white label networks is like, you have to get them to like sign up for your thing. And so I think the tools will exist, but it's sort of in some ways a shame that the network became harder to bootstrap because of this pendulum swing that we went to with like closing off everything and Facebook as a open platform becoming like a non-thing. And like, I don't know if I'm optimistic that like maybe something else will eventually become that open platform. Maybe it's like an Apple, Google thing. I don't know. But like, to me, that's a little bit sad that like, it's a lot harder for you to do the thing you're trying to do. And like in 2020, it could have been a lot easier. So I don't know, maybe that's like a slightly pessimistic answer, but I think from a tool standpoint, you can find them, but it's, you still have this challenge of like, how do you bootstrap the network, which didn't necessarily have to happen.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm back. Sorry, my power went out for a bit there, so I was just like, no. But the next question is from David. Did you want to hop on?
Sure. Hey, thanks for all your insights. Really beneficial. So my question is around how you see consumer fitting in with like video-based stuffs, because there's a lot of like hype around video right now. And so I'm curious if you have any perspective on that, or maybe could share any insights you've seen around behavior in video, if you're looking to build like in video and consumer behavior.
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't know if I have any like super specific video things, but I can maybe share an anecdote that could be kind of interesting, which is I think video is actually a good example of like, it's just a format, but it's not like it doesn't like create a new behavior. It just like, if I was trying to have a like this conversation is augmented by the fact that like we can see each other's video, but it didn't like it didn't like create the ability for people to like talk and connect. It definitely like improves the fidelity and the bandwidth of our interaction. And that's really awesome. But I think like, it's funny to think of video as like a category, like outside of things like the movies and TVs and like Netflix and stuff. Like I think that is like a video thing. But for example, at Facebook, we had a team that was the video team. And initially the video team, and I think Shabir worked on the video team at some point along with us. So he might have some stuff to add here. But the video team, I think it started by basically like, we needed to build video into Facebook as a thing because you couldn't like share a video on Facebook. So it built like the video player. And then it kind of went from there to like live video and all sorts of other video related things, the watch tab. And when Alex and I and Shabir was around at the time too, we were working on the video team. One of the things I always thought was kind of funny was that like when we would ask people, like because teams were kind of siloed and would do their own roadmaps and their own research, and we would like, as the video team, go and like ask people on Facebook like about their experience with video, and people would be like, what do you mean there's like a video team? Or like no one experiences Facebook as like, am I watching a video or am I not watching a video? It's just like, it's just Facebook. It's a news feed, and they like tap on a thing, and they would be frustrated when they tap on a video and be like force them to this like video tab, because like it's so arbitrary. Like it's just like this was a photo and this was a video, this was a link. And so that was kind of a good lesson for me, I think, which is like, I think there are some things where like video is the thing, and video enables a new category. And I'm probably not a good person to like wax poetic about that, because I haven't really thought about that at all. With Cocoon, I can tell you like we don't really think about us as like a video app, or like video as this like new thing. Like video is a component of Cocoon. You can share videos in Cocoon. We have like a pretty unique like take on like video calling, but in that case, like it's more about like the dynamics around video that are what we think about more. So yeah, I don't know, it might be kind of like a not satisfying answer, other than like maybe an interesting anecdote from the Facebook research time that like, I don't know if a lot of people in the real world think about video as like a separate thing or category.
No, yeah, I mean, it's helpful to hear like just that, you know, video is one form of delivering content to people, but what you're doing is bigger than that is a good way of looking at it. So thanks.
One thing I'll add to that you said, Sachin, is it's kind of interesting that like video came onto Facebook as this mechanism by which you could grab people's attention and people can engage with content and all that. But part of the reason you were brought on the team was to kind of think about like, how do we actually evolve our video products to actually be a conduit for social interaction and like meeting people, understanding viewpoints and things like that, and not necessarily just a passive consumption mechanism. So it evolved from like this thing that moved business metrics and was like valuable for the platform from that world to this thing that actually needed to become more ingrained into the mission of the company and what the platform was trying to be. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it's a good point.
I have a question too, Cameron. Can I jump in, or is there a queue?
Yeah, there's a queue on Slack,
Okay,
actually.
cool. I'll post it on Slack. I don't think I'm in.
Awesome. Yair, did you want to hop on?
Sure. Yeah, so kind of a generic question, but you mentioned kind of your take on verticals on the kind of consumer social space. You're targeting a niche that's kind of like small, intimate communities. You see other kind of open spaces like that could use their own product?
I think so. I think I think like, I don't know if this is generalizable, but for us, we kind of had to think about like 3 things that typically get thought about serially together at once. And those 3 things are like, what is the product that like, is there room for a product that could help a specific type of niche do a thing? And that's kind of like the first thing you usually think about. But then there's 2 other components to actually like making that work, which is like distribution and how you're going to grow this thing, and monetization, like how you're going to like make sure you don't like die, which has happened a lot in our space in particular. And so the reason I bring this up is because I think that like the set of things that are green field for product opportunities is like really, really wide, like kind of going back to the like presentation of like, there's like everything left to do. But I do think that there's these windows of opportunity that that kind of open up, and kind of that domino falling type element. And that like, I don't think we could have really tried to have a fighting chance at building Cocoon before Apple and Google had the subscriptions infrastructure in place, let alone the behavior I talked about. Like it was just, you couldn't have even like done this very well a little while ago. And if advertising is the only proven business model, which to this day is still really the case in our space, then you're kind of screwed, because the best product for this use case will never attract enough attention and time spent and to generate enough ad supply. So like even if we wanted to make Cocoon an ads-based business, it would be the world's worst ads business, because we try to not have you spend a lot of time in the app. We like try to make it really efficient. You can like come in, feel close to your people, like post a thing, and then like bounce. And there's no like endless jar of content or anything like that. So Cocoon would only really work if we could find a way for people to pay for it directly in some capacity. And I do think that there's like, I haven't thought about this enough, I guess, but I think that would be the lens I would think about. Like not only just like where there's greenfield product opportunity, but like, is there a way to marry product distribution and monetization? And I don't think Cocoon has proven that this works, but like we have a theory for how those 3 things can kind of come together. I think other spaces, I would look at like things that people, if you're gonna kind of go the consumer subscription route or some paid model as opposed to like the ads model, which I think opens up a lot of things, you kind of have to find a thing that like, at some point could feel like a no-brainer for people to pay for. And I think in Cocoon's case, it could be like, if you really feel closer to your grandparent, to your grandkids or your mom or your sister, even by like 1%, that is priceless. And I think there's other social apps that could look and feel like Cocoon and could work like that. But like if they're targeting a different use case, like teens is like a big one that like most social apps kind of focus on that market. And I think it's just really hard to get like you could get an app that gets like millions of teenagers to use it, but like, I don't know, like, could you get someone to be like, yeah, no brainer, I'm going to pay? Like, it might be hard. And so I would look at it through that lens. Like, how could you get to a point where if this works, at some point it's a no brainer?
Cool, thanks.
Sachin, I just want to be cognizant of time. We have like maybe a minute left and like 5 more questions in the Slack. Are you able to run a little bit over? Is that? Yeah. Okay, cool. So next, Jeremy, do you want to hop on?
Yeah. Hey, Sachin, thanks so much. I really appreciated your framing around like this migration of like time spent in the digital sphere versus like the physical space and like this analogy to like urbanization. And I guess one of these like, call it fire department or sanitation analogies like to today, in my opinion, is like privacy and security, like on the consumer side. And I guess like my question is, like, do you inherently see those as just like features of these larger platforms and we're going to have this like swing back towards these like super private communities? Like, or do you think it's possible like security and privacy are potentially like independent value propositions whereby like they're not like chiefly the responsibility of these larger platform companies, but it's in fact like an entirely different relationship that we have that's enabled by consumer subscription?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think maybe like to some extent both. Like I haven't thought about this until just now, but if I look at the like physical world parallel again, like it sort of feels like there's some level of like just baseline practices around privacy and security that we just sort of like figured out, no brainer. Like you have locks on your doors and you like lock your door at night, and you like, most people who live in a city would probably have some sort of like alarm system or whatever. And then like you can go above and beyond, and you can like live in a building in New York that has a doorman, and you can like have a Nest Cam. You can do all these things if you like care more about that. But like everyone's going to get to like some baseline layer of privacy. And right now, I don't think we're there yet with like the social web. Like I think we're still kind of like figuring it out. So I see like every platform, big and small, will probably have some base layer. I mean, in the case of like very real terms, I think we're already there to some extent with like, not everything is end-to-end encrypted, but pretty much everything is like encrypted in transit, and like there's some base level of like encryption that like most things just have. So I think there's, yeah, maybe that's how I think about it, is there's gonna be a base layer that everything has, and then there'll be like, if you care a lot about security and encryption and privacy, there'll be things like Signal and Telegram or whatever that you can go to. But like you'll have a trade-off where like I'd probably not want to have like my family group chat on something like Telegram, just given the way we're going to use it. I'd rather have something like, I would rather make the trade-off of like kind of warm and delight and sharing and intimacy versus like cold kind of private utilitarianism. But for some chats, like that works too. So like I'm kind of optimistic for that.
And do you think like the implication like of your I guess groupings there is that like for that elevated level, like that does fit your definition of like subscription enabled business model? Like people
Oh
care.
yeah, I think so. Well, the reason why it might not is because for whatever reason that has proven to be something that like, I think we're in a very weird set of circumstances where there's like a couple of businesses that don't need to ever be profitable that did this and got to hundreds of millions of free users and will never have to make money. And they're funded by like the founders of WhatsApp and the founders of vKontakte in Russia. And so like Telegram and Signal, I think might just have like been market anomalies. So I don't know, I think it'd be tough now just because of that like weird set of circumstances where two really rich guys just like funded this.
Cool.
So I don't know,
Thank
it's a weird one.
I appreciate it.
Awesome. So we have like 3 more. Yakov, do you want to hop on?
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Sweet. Thanks, Sachin. This is a super cool call with an awesome group of people around it. The thing that I'm wondering about is in terms of new social networks, What do you say about enabling a new kind of experience, perhaps around a new content format in an existing network? Like, how do you navigate that? Which is, I think, the case with Cocoon, for example.
Okay, so a new form of experience, but in an existing network.
Right. Like, what's the go-to-market there? What's the strategy there?
Okay. I've actually thought about Cocoon a little bit differently. Like another thing that came up as a common objection when we were fundraising was that like every new social app needs to enable a new format. And so like, you know, like Snapchat is like ephemeral pictures, and with Instagram, it was like filters and stuff. And like, I think that sometimes is true, but I don't actually think that that always has to be the case. And I think that in Cocoon's case, it's not that you couldn't do this thing before, it's that you didn't do this thing before. Like my mom would never text me because she didn't want to interrupt my day. It was funny actually, when I was working at Facebook, she would never text me. And then as soon as I left and started working on Cocoon, she'd be like, oh, now that you're unemployed, I can like bug you during the day. And I was like, Mom, I swear I'm working hard. But like, it's more, I think in our case, it was a bit more of like a context and recipe game, and not it was all the stuff I was talking about before around like, how can you design a space for low pressure sharing? But it's not like you couldn't share that photo before. It's just that you didn't share that photo before. So I don't know if it's, maybe that answers your question a little bit of like, I think there are just multiple go-to-market strategies. One of them is like, oh yeah, you literally couldn't do this thing before. I just don't think that there are that many things like that. And I think even in the case of Instagram, it wasn't really that you couldn't share a filtered photo. It was, in that case, it was actually enabling a thing that cost 99 cents, giving it for free. Like there were a bunch of really good filter apps. They all cost money. Instagram basically was a free version of that also had like smart network features. And the use case there was actually ended up becoming nothing to do with photos, but just like status and broadcast sharing, and kind of a better version of what people were using Facebook for. Yeah, and something like WhatsApp is a really good example of that, where it's definitely, I mean, the thing that enabled, I guess, it was a paid thing that became free, but wasn't like a new thing. It wasn't like you couldn't do this before. So I don't know. I think there are just multiple ways of going about it. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about, where like, I think one of the reasons people think that social is dead is because if you just follow the same playbook over and over again, you kind of run out of juice. But like, there's a lot more problems to solve, and you just have to think about them from first principles. And it's like, you'll still fail a lot, but I think it opens up some new opportunity.
Cool, thanks. I appreciate that.
All right, Edgar, you want to hop on?
Yeah, thanks, Sachin, for your time. I really appreciated the insights as well. And this is a related question to the one right before around distribution. So typically, I guess for distribution for early startups, you have performance marketing, you have content, and you have like some referral-based system. And then you mentioned that in the case of Cocoon and maybe other new forms of consumer subscription, you can't focus on the referral or virality more so element, because it's just not built in that nature. And then you're not really producing public content to drive like a content loop on that side. And so how do you see yourself scaling over the long term without like a deep dive on performance marketing? And if like CAC starts to go up because there's all this competition, like how do you scale that over time?
Yeah, good question. We've actually basically never spent on paid acquisition until we just started experimenting a little bit, basically the other day, and it's been interesting so far. But I think that the virality component of Cocoon is actually very important and very intentionally designed. It's just a different kind of virality, that it's slower and constrained, but a lot more sustainable over the long run. And the reason is that in a typical social app, if you sign up right away and then you like ask someone to like sync their contacts, and then they do that like on day one, and then like those people join, and like that's a way to really spread like wildfire, and you can like shoot up to the top of the app store, and it's like that's great. But in the case of the problem you're trying to solve for Cocoon, that would break the whole thing, right? So we can't do that. But Cocoon only works when you are in it with other people. And so there's basically 2 degrees of virality that are really important to us. One is helping ensure that a creator of a Cocoon successfully assembles their initial first group. And usually people start using Cocoon because they have a very specific group in mind, actually a very specific group chat in mind that they don't like in WhatsApp or iMessage or whatever, for whatever reason. And they're like, okay, cool, I want to like bring this over to Cocoon and kind of give it this like upgrade. and they have to convince their group to join, and that's hard. There's lots of drop off. But if they can do that, then there's that first degree of virality, and then it's done. You're never going to add more people to that group by definition. But the way Cocoon can grow in the long run is that if that group is having a really good time in Cocoon over the course of days and weeks, and again, this isn't the kind of thing that's going to instantly make you feel better and solve all your problems on day one by definition. The whole point is that like now that you have this kind of close proximity every day for days and weeks and months, and we are just now starting to see the first cohorts of people who have been using it for a year. And so talking to them has been really interesting to see kind of like the role that like kind of longitudinal like analysis of this is working. And we talked to people who are like, have been using it for like months and then just go to create their second Cocoon like months later. But we think that's really good, even though it took there's a long period of that second order virality. At that point, they have a really clear hypothesis for another group they would want, and they can get those people in, and then eventually, hopefully, some subset of those people invite another group. And so our virality is like overlapping groups and not overlapping nodes and individuals. But we think that that is the right way to solve this problem. It's just it's a much slower cycle than the like sync your contacts on day one and like send everyone an SMS.
Right. No, that's really interesting. So it basically ends up being quality-based virality in terms of those like real relationships, and 1 to 2 groups basically per person for those close ones, as opposed to quantity and pushing for virality as quickly as possible. But that's
you have to have a very specific reason for wanting to invite someone into your Cocoon, which isn't necessarily the case for most social apps. You'd kind of just be like, oh, anyone in my contact book who's using this, I'll like friend them or whatever. And like, as a result, the problem I'm solving is like filling up my feed, and like, it's just a very different reason for doing it. So yeah, I think you just kind of have to have I mean, I think there's other apps that have no virality that still manage to grow with subscriptions, like the Comms and Headspaces of the world. And that is like full on payback for the most part. So in our case, we'll probably end up with some split, but I think the organic component could be a lot more powerful and important than something like a meditation app.
Definitely. Thanks so much.
All right, we have one more after this one. Yulia, do you want to hop on?
Yeah, thank you so much for a really great session. I actually had a quick question. So it seems that because there's so much more, there's not of that virality components, how are you guys going about your validation? Especially, I would imagine there is a lot of conversation around, oh, well, we're using WhatsApp, like this is fine. How did you even run that process around discovery?
Yeah. Oh man. Okay. Well, really early on, I don't know, are you at like a early stage of starting something?
No, so we're launching an enterprise SaaS platform, but I've always had an interest in this, and just hearing you frame some of these things kind of catalyzed other thoughts. So
cool. Okay, well, in the very early days, like at the time I sent that note to Alex and when we left and we were thinking about stuff, the first thing is I did a lot of just like surveys. There's this really good tool where you can like, well, I mean, at the time I just used SurveyMonkey. I'd like create these surveys and like, we'd ask a bunch of questions. We would email it out to a bunch of people, have them email out to people. And we would get like, we ran like a couple of these and we would get like I don't know if it's like statistically significant, but we get like a couple hundred responses. And the first survey that really showed us that there was something here, we thought, was we asked people, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was basically like, how close do you feel with like, specifically it was family. We were really focused on family at the time. How close do you feel with family members that you don't see every day? And that was like an answer. And then how close do you want to feel? And it was like more. We're like, okay, cool. It's not that crazy. But then we asked like, what would you, if you could wave a magic wand and like know anything about your family members that you don't know on a day-to-day basis, what would you want to know? And it wasn't like, I want to see like photos and updates. It was like a lot of these, like what we were kind of thinking about is like temperature checks. Like, I just want to know if they're having a good day or a bad day. And like, did they like do anything that day? And like, it was all these things that were like, oh yeah, there's no way you're going to like text that. Like, I mean, some people might, but like for most families, probably you're not constantly texting each other like, hey, did you have a good day or whatnot? But I realized that like, you know, in my case with my family, like it was really like, again, kind of this context problem. It wasn't that I literally couldn't ask that. It was just like, I wouldn't do that. And so the first surveys kind of helped us just like realize that like, oh yeah, there's a bit of a gap between what people would like want with their groups like family and what they're getting. And the reason that gap exists and looking at the things that they would want are things that just like are really hard to translate in text. So that was kind of like initially the way we tried validating things were with like surveys and just talking to lots of people. And then I think, and this might be somewhat specific to Cocoon, but maybe not super specific, is what's nice about Cocoon is you don't need a huge network in order for it to work for one person. Like something like Twitter or Instagram or whatever, if there were just like 10 people on Twitter, it'd be like kind of hard for you to really get the full Twitter experience, right? So like when Twitter goes from 10 people to 10,000 to a million to 10 million, that improves the experience of Twitter for everyone. With Cocoon, it doesn't really matter if there are 1 million people using the app or 5 people using the app. All that matters is, are your 5 people there? And so that was really nice because we were able to like quickly validate by just like forcing some people to like set up Cocoons in the very beginning, that like just having a space for a group like this and having the low pressure space to share in this way was starting to work, and people were starting to like qualitatively respond to it positively. So that really helped. That doesn't like show you have a scalable business, because like from there you still have to figure out how to grow and all that stuff. But I think it at least can help you check off that first bucket of like, oh yeah, like this is working for like at least one group. And if it can work for one group, there's no reason why it can't work for lots of groups.
Thanks.
Awesome. So our last question is from Dahlia, and she had to hop off, so I will stand in for her. She is thinking about their community roadmap on 2 dimensions, asynchronous and synchronous connection across a loosely connected network. And she's wondering, what are some of the best practices and pitfalls that you've seen with regard to asynchronous elements of community building, especially when people don't already know each other well?
Cool. I don't know if I have like nothing comes to mind immediately other than the fact that I think one thing we've learned is that the lines between asynchronous and synchronous are kind of blurrier than they seem. And I think that's a recent phenomenon with like the fact that we're always online. So like before it was like you either were like synchronously talking or asynchronous, and all text messaging or any sort of form of that was asynchronous. But now like that's not really true. And I think what we learned, maybe a lesson that's somewhat helpful, is in the beginning, we thought of Cocoon as like purely, like literally the most asynchronous thing. Like the whole point is that it's like asynchronous and low pressure. And so we actually had 0 notifications at all because like notifications are like for synchronous, and we were like asynchronous. And we thought you could just like put stuff in there, and then when people wanted to feel closer to each other, to their loved ones, and get a window into what was going on, they'd open up the app and they could see what was up. And that surprisingly worked like okay, like people opened up the app at all, which was cool. But we heard that a lot of people were kind of like wanting notifications because it was like one of the few notifications that represented something that they wanted always on their phone. It was like going to be good for sure. And so we've actually kind of blurred the lines a bit in the product lately with asynchronous and synchronous, and we have notifications, they're silent instead of so they don't interrupt you. And we've realized that was kind of a distinction of like, for a new thing on your phone, it could either interrupt what you're doing in the real world, or it could surface the next time you just check your phone naturally, which is different, or it could surface the next time you open up the app. And that was where we were before. And then we kind of moved one notch this way, and that's like moving a notch in synchronicity, but it's still, we think, asynchronous-ish. And that worked a lot better. So I think like maybe the lesson is to like not really, like there are differences, but maybe that there's not like a clear recipe for either. And that like, I mean, in our case, it was like literally asking people what they wanted and just trying to do that, even if it wasn't our intuition. And that helped us find the balance a little bit.
Awesome, super helpful. That was our last one. Yulia, if you have another question, you might want to, you can maybe lob it,
Sure,
but we are 15 minutes over.
Yeah, and if people need to drop off, that's cool too.
You've been so generous with us already. I just have a really quick question, which is actually my original question. You know, when Cocoon launched, it was so beautifully designed, like gorgeous. And I actually have a few friends that kind of try to tackle the space, and it like blew everything out of the water. So my question was, you know, we hear a lot about MVPs being kind of these skeletons, so of like the bare bone minimum. Is that kind of, do you guys have like a soft launch before this to really validate it? Okay, so you did. So it wasn't like, because I saw the announcement when you guys, I think, raised the rounds, and like it was just like a fully finished, beautiful product. So I was just wondering whether you guys kind of were in stealth until the launch, or
yeah, we had been testing very early versions of Cocoon for probably like 8 or 9 months at that point, and they were pretty skeletal. Yeah, so definitely, yeah, that wasn't like the first thing out the gate. The other thing I'd say though is that there's certain products where the feature is actually that it's fully featured. And we were really inspired by Notion. We had been using that for running our company, and we had spent some time with that team, and they had a similar story, I think, too, or more extreme story, that like we started using Notion, I think, right around the time that it was starting to kind of like break out. And our first reaction was like, holy shit, like everything we want is just here, and it's just so polished. And like how did we just hear about this yesterday? Like, that's crazy. And the answer was that they'd been working on it for like 3 years at the time, or 4 years. And if you think about their space, it's like you're competing with like Google Docs and other things that have been built for like decades that are really fully featured and do everything and hook up to everything. And like, it's such an uphill battle, and like, it won't work unless it can do everything. And if it can't do everything, then people will find an excuse to just like switch back, or like it's an all or nothing product. I think Cocoon is probably like that, where we're competing with things that have been around for a really long time, that have this inertia, that have literally thousands and thousands of engineers, designers, everything working on them, are somewhat surprisingly still not very full featured, but they're full featured in a different way, which is that they have to support every relationship and every use case. So they're kind of like this. Like, if you want to, like, if you could text me on WhatsApp right now, I could text my mom on WhatsApp. I could do a 50-person group. I could have a one-on-one thread. It'll just work. It'll work for everything. It's flexible on the dimension of who you use it with, but it's not very flexible on the dimension of what you're going to do in that thread. And so that was, I think, the reason Cocoon feels very fully featured, I think, is because it's really focused on one. You're probably only going to use it for like 1 or 2 groups. We can make a bunch of assumptions as to who those people are, so we can make decisions that like are really difficult to be making if you're trying to do the WhatsApp thing. Like, you know, WhatsApp, if it automatically shared your location with everyone you're in, would be like pretty crazy. But in our case, we can kind of like make that assumption that like the whole point of using this is to feel closer, and like that's the thing that like we can do. Even the design, like I think the design of WhatsApp, we kind of joke about how utilitarian it is and boring and bland, but like it's that for a reason. It's meant to look like SMS. If it was like looked like Cocoon, I don't know if it would work. So yeah, I don't know. I think, yeah, the answer to your question though is like, we've been working on it for a while. I think that it might be, I mean, Alex, the designer behind Cocoon, I'll pass all your feedback to him. He's awesome. And it's really his brainchild. But I think like the reason why it's a little bit easier to make it feel so polished and fully featured is because we're only trying to do one thing. Like I mentioned at the beginning, and every other social app and messaging app for the most part is actually trying to do like a lot of things. Facebook being the most extreme example, where like you can like sell your couch, you can like date, you can like find a job, you can like run an ad for your small business, you can like get the news, you can get everything there. And like, you can't do any of those things on Cocoon, obviously, but we're going to do this one thing, and we're going to just try to do it really well. And like, hopefully we can, like, it's actually not that high of a bar to clear, because like no one else is even trying.
Awesome, thanks.
Cool. And when I say no one else is even trying, I didn't mean to disparage other folks who are trying. I meant that the big competitors or the big incumbents aren't trying. And I think, and I do think fewer people have tried on the outside maybe than because of how hard it's been. But yeah, the current like suite of tools that people use for this aren't trying to solve this problem very intently. Cool.
Sweet. Thank you so much, Sachin. This has been amazing. Thank you for letting us go over to a lot of really good questions for you. So yeah, we're super grateful for your time.
Cool. Thank you for having me. That was really fun. It's fun to meet you all. Yeah. You're all working on interesting things, it seems, and yeah, happy to stay in touch